To say the world ocean is massive doesn't even begin to cover it.
The massive body of salt water covers more than 70% of our planet.
But these waters need our help.
From billions of pounds of plastic.
We can't remove them once they're there and in these small sizes.
To unintended consequences of business and recreation.
Our economy was devastated. Restaurants had to close.
The whales can't afford to have a single entanglement.
Our oceans demand urgent action to protect them from natural and man-made threats.
Solutions are on the horizon. In fact, some are already here.
As we move forward and move into this era of really rapid change, we have a new tool in our tool belt.
For National Ocean Month, we're looking at where things stand and what it takes to conserve and restore the world's oceans.
It's like our treasure, it's our nest egg. Saving the ocean is saving the planet.
Saving the planet for us and generations to come.
Hello and welcome to our Spectrum News special, Saving Our Oceans, a Deep Dive. I'm Sarah Pila, along the coast of Santa Monica in California.
And I'm Curtis McLeod at the beach in Cape Canaveral, Florida. We partnered with the nonprofit Oceana to explore the most pressing issues confronting ocean conservation.
We're also diving into what we can do to restore our oceans from coast to coast. The ocean covers more than 70% of our planet. In fact, 97% of Earth's water is in our oceans, but they need our help.
Tara Lynn Wagner shows us why scientists believe protecting the ocean could help stem the tide of rising temperatures and a changing environment.
It's just another world down there.
This rather alien-looking camera is just one of the tools Dr. Jeff Shester uses to explore a foreign world.
It's basically as close as we can get to really being on another planet.
Jeff fell in love with the ocean when he first began scuba diving, a love that led him to submerge himself in a career with Oceana, where he spends his time studying life under the sea.
Those are called hydrocorals.
Using tools like that camera or this underwater robot he affectionately calls Gino.
Come here, little Gino. It's all about using new technology to help save the ocean.
Ocean health is something that worries him every day. What many fail to realize, he says, is how connected what we do above ground is to what's happening beneath the waves. Take, for instance, greenhouse gas emissions. Gases like carbon dioxide trap heat in the atmosphere. But for decades, the ocean has acted as a sort of buffer, absorbing over 90% of the heat and CO2 we release into the air.
If we didn't have the ocean and we were putting all this carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the planet would be about 100 degrees hotter right now, which would essentially make the entire planet inhospitable.
It's an important role, but it comes at a cost. Just as temperatures are rising on Earth, the ocean is also experiencing heat waves, enough to damage fisheries, wildlife, and deep-sea coral.
And even just a few degrees of temperature change can mean life or death for a lot of the ocean animals.
CO2 is also making the oceans more acidic, which makes it more difficult for crabs and oysters to build their shells.
And once you get over some of these tipping points, you really can't go back.
But despite these alarming trends, Jeff remains buoyed.
To me, the ocean is a source of hope. It is amazing how resilient the ocean can be.
Marine protected areas where humans fishing and drilling are all off limits are now once again teeming with marine life. The 30 by 30 initiative is a global effort to protect 30% of the ocean in this way by 2030. He also stresses the need to end our reliance on fossil fuels, not only because of environmental concerns, but also man-made disasters like oil spills.
Which essentially are going to happen. There's no way to ultimately prevent oil spills, and sadly, there's really no way to clean them up.
Surrounded by water, Jeff keeps a watchful eye on all of it. Creatures big and small.
It could be dangerous, mister.
Those that fly and those that swim. And of course, he's watching the horizon. Changes are already happening out there in the vast ocean, but he believes it's not too late to turn the tide.
There is another man-made threat. We're talking about plastics here. Most of the debris that winds up in the water is plastic.
That's right, Curtis. Oceana says about 33 billion pounds enter the ocean every year. Now, that's roughly the same as dumping 2 garbage trucks full of plastic every minute, and it never really goes away.
Kate McVeigh stopped along Florida's Gulf Coast to explain the problem with microplastics.
More than 1,300 miles of shoreline surround the state of Florida. And here on the West Coast, sugar sand beaches are met with the blue-green waters of the Gulf of Mexico. Eckerd College sits along Boca Ciega Bay, part of the intracoastal waterway that leads to the Gulf. A good spot, says Professor Shannon Gowans, to collect water samples.
So what we're trying to do is collect up 5 gallons of water and see what's in here.
There's a very good chance she'll find microplastics, an emerging contaminant that is showing up in oceans around the world. It happens when our trash, things like plastic bags and water bottles, make their way into bodies of water. Over time, that plastic breaks down into smaller pieces, by definition 5 millimeters or less. So small, Gowans must use a microscope to detect it. First, she adds fluorescent dye, then places the sample under the lens and turns out the lights. Thanks to the dye, the pieces that are plastic glow.
This is clearly a plastic piece, and again, we wouldn't be able to see that with our eyes. It's only when we can use that dye and being able to zoom in and see these really tiny plastic pieces.
Emphasis on the micro part, a major hurdle, says Gowans, when it comes to addressing the problem.
We can't remove them once they're there and in these small sizes. What we need to do is stop them from getting in the bay in the first place.
While research on microplastics is still relatively new, we do know one of the biggest culprits is single-use plastics. So far, efforts to scale back use have been mixed, with 10 states enacting statewide bans on single-use plastic bags. But nearly double that amount, 17, have what are known as preemptive laws on the books to stop even local municipalities from doing the same. For states like Florida that have preemptive laws, that individual sense of responsibility will play a big role moving forward in cutting back on single-use plastics and ultimately microplastics in our waterways.
So what can we do about the problem? It seems recycling isn't the answer. A recent study found out of all the plastics that's ever been produced, only 9% has been recycled.
But there are alternatives. New York has been leading the way in single-use plastic reform. And Lewis Finley takes a closer look at what's already being done and what could be next.
No matter how much you buy here, you can't get a single-use plastic bag to carry your purchases home anymore.
They don't like it.
Carly Peralta, who owns this Northern Manhattan mini market, says customers still complain about the state's ban on single-use plastic bags implemented in October of 2020.
They're getting used to it, to bringing their own bags, but sometimes they forget, they don't want to pay for it.
The reusable bags are for sale at many locations, and there's often a recyclable paper option available too. Before the single-use plastic bag ban went into effect, the city's Department of Sanitation said residents used more than 10 billion single-use carry-out bags every year. The department is planning another study for next year.
Trash has always been an issue in New York City.
Former City Council member Raphael Espinal supported bills to protect the environment, which went further than the plastic bag ban, including a city ban on styrofoam containers now in effect.
At the end of the day, we do have to look at who is producing these materials and go after most manufacturers.
Brian Langlos agrees that plastic manufacturers should be held accountable. He's an organizer for the environmental group Oceana, which works to protect and restore oceans.
Instead of allowing them to push off the cost of doing business on the taxpayers, I think that's the path forward to a plastic-free New York.
Langlos is lobbying state lawmakers to consider 2 bills to reduce dependence on single-use plastics. One of the measures would make single-use plastic utensils at restaurants available only upon request. Another does the same for single-use plastic straws and single-use plastic stirrers.
88% of New York voters support policies at the state and local level to curb single-use plastic products.
But small shop owners like Peralta say low-income communities are paying the price for the restrictions and bans.
They don't have enough for the 25 cents for the bag. I'll be like, okay, you can have one.
Peralta says she tries to pass along the added cost of paper bags, but sometimes it's better to take a small loss than to lose a customer who can't afford it.
It's not only plastic. There's more potential for pollution under the ocean's surface. Activists are pushing to curb offshore drilling, but that doesn't mean we can't still utilize the sea for energy. How the U.S. is turning the tide on traditional power generation, coming up.
Offshore drilling accounts for about 30% of the world's oil production and gas production, but potential spills and pollution pose dangers to marine life and the ocean itself. Advocates are pushing to stop the expansion of rigs underneath the sea, but that could be a blow to workers and economies that rely on the offshore oil industry. Mitch Perry dives into all sides of the issue along the Gulf Coast.
Robin Miller has served as the president and CEO for the Tampa Bay Beaches Chamber of Commerce for 15 years. She says that when the Deepwater Horizon oil spill of 2010 left thick globs of oil that washed ashore along the beaches of Pensacola, the economic effect was felt 400 miles away in the Tampa Bay area.
Our economy was devastated here in Pinellas County. Restaurants had to close because they didn't have customers. We didn't have the tourist visitation that we typically had.
Miller says it even affected the local real estate market.
Because people thought there was oil, and once there is a perception of a presence of oil on the environment or on our sand, that presence sticks like oil sticks, and people thought that it wouldn't go away.
But rising gasoline prices have renewed talk among some oil executives about repealing both the current federal moratorium as well as a 2018 constitutional amendment in Florida that bans drilling off of state waters.
We're going to hit over $5 a gallon, which is going to be an all-time high. Before the summer ends, it's predicted that it's going to be over $6. It could be near $7 or $8 by the end of this year. Americans are already fed up.
St. Petersburg-based Congressman and Democratic gubernatorial candidate Charlie Crist is co-sponsor of legislation that would permanently ban drilling off of Florida's coast. But in 2008, as gas prices went over $4 a gallon, Crist supported a proposal by Senator John McCain to lift the moratorium and leave drilling up to individual states.
Well, I think the key word is look at it, not necessarily do it. And that's why I was open to at least exploring.
Then 2 years later, Deepwater Horizon happened, changing Crist's perspective on the issue.
And you learn from those lessons, hopefully. I certainly have. That's why I would never let drilling off the coast of Florida ever happen.
A spokesperson for Florida Governor Ron DeSantis told Spectrum News in a statement that, quote, Governor DeSantis does not support drilling off the coasts of Florida, and even being faced with the need to consider it is a product of President Biden's policy failures.
President Joe Biden did include a permanent ban on offshore drilling in the eastern Gulf Coast in his Build Back Better plan that passed the House, but it's currently dead on arrival in the U.S. Senate.
Curtis, the United States is trying to move away from traditional energy sources like oil and gas and move toward renewable energy like wind. Now, offshore wind farms could significantly cut back on CO2 emissions and protect our environment. Right now, the U.S. only has 2 operational offshore wind farms off the coast of Rhode Island and Virginia. But the Biden-Harris administration has plans to boost that number over the next few years, including off the coast of North Carolina. Noelle Lashley explains.
It's a beautiful day for a ferry ride. And North Carolina native Randy Sturgill is drinking in the view of the ocean he's loved his entire life.
Here's my office at this particular moment, and what a view I have.
He's a senior field representative for the nonprofit Oceana.
No matter if it's choppy and rough or it's slick as glass, it is a beautiful thing.
He says part of caring for one of the great loves of his life is investing in offshore wind.
All passengers, please return to your vehicles.
North Carolina doesn't have any offshore wind turbines yet.
Thank you, sir.
But we're driving to see where they're expected to be built in the future. According to North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper's office, the state has a target of 2.8 gigawatts of energy generation from offshore wind by 2030 and 8 gigawatts by 2040, enough to power over 2 million homes.
It's extremely important for North Carolina because we have such a wind potential, and also looking at the jobs it would bring to North Carolina.
This is Caswell Beach, about an hour south of Wilmington. Sturgill says the turbines, which will be miles out at sea, will go right about here. But there's some offshore wind resistance.
You hear concerns from some in the fishing community. Some think it'll harm.
Others worry about the view. Sturgill told me that based on visualizations he's seen,
you just can see them over the horizon.
Again, North Carolina doesn't have any offshore wind turbines quite yet, but he says seeing the project move forward gives him hope for the future.
I just can't wait to see the first turbines out there.
And he hopes his work to protect the environment and his beloved ocean will help generations to come.
Lawmakers in Washington are working on solutions to help our waters. That's the big picture. But what can you do to conserve and restore the oceans? The answer's next.
For the last 2 decades, the international advocacy group Oceana has been focused solely on protecting and restoring the world's oceans. It's a big job on a global scale, and Oceana can't do it alone. Joe Kwan spent some time with one team member off the coast of San Diego County to show us what we can do right now.
Do you offer advice to people that say, hey, I love the ocean, I want to do something to help protect it, keep it, accessible, clean? What do you tell people?
People, regardless if they're living coastal or inland, are able to contribute to the plastic pollution problem. At any level, the first advice I give is, if possible, as a consumer, to purchase refillable and or reusable options, such as reusable water bottles, utensils, lunch boxes, takeaway containers, and grocery bags. Secondly, and what I would put probably as my top priority, is reaching out to elected officials. We are the constituents, and we have elected them to help us in the endeavors that we find near and dear to our heart. So reaching out to your local representatives and senators and encouraging them to protect us against single-use plastic use is really the #1 way that I think true change can occur.
Has anybody asked your organization why plastic free, and what the connection is to the ocean? What do you say to them?
I encourage folks to research and educate themselves, knowing there are multiple threats to our oceans and the environment, which include overfishing, pollution, and climate change created by greenhouse gas emissions. But plastics is the #1 thing right now that we can't get away from. It's in everything. It's made to be used once and then discarded, even though it's a product that will last lifetimes and millions of years.
If somebody said, what's the point of all this? I'm just gonna live my life, do my things, what would you say to them?
That it isn't only about them. It's about all of us as people, and our children, our animals, on land, in the ocean. It's about what we enjoy to do, where we surf, where we swim. And for those, again, who don't live coastal, it still affects them too. It's ending up in their food and their water. It's flooding us. Any one change makes a difference. So everyone has to think a little bit bigger picture, that it's better for our world and for planet Earth.
Like you just heard Morris say, one way to take action to reduce plastic pollution is to contact your local representatives. But some lawmakers are already making moves to protect the environment and specifically our oceans. Washington correspondent Cassie Simeon shows us what's in the works on Capitol Hill.
Congressman Alan Lowenthal has been representing the Long Beach area of California for nearly 10 years. And in that time, he has been a champion for environmental bills, including Plastic Pellet-Free Waters Act and the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act. But he became passionate about ocean and water protections long before he began the commute to Washington.
I was on the city council many years ago, and they would start to pound at my door or call me and say, what are you going to do about all this trash that comes down the LA River that ends up on our beaches?
And his passion was fueled further after a trip to Antarctica a few years ago.
Many of the scientists, when we found fish or animals that had died, they cut them open, and guess what? They were all filled with plastic. We're talking about in Antarctica. It was a shock.
It spurred Lowenthal to introduce the Break Free from Plastic Pollutions Act, aimed at reducing plastic production, increasing recycling efforts, and changing incentives in the industry. It's a move environmental groups like Oceana say are necessary. Jackie Savitz, who has been lobbying on the Hill for 20 years to protect ocean water, says ditching plastics could not only help with climate change, but also help to feed the global community.
We're trying to build ocean abundance because by managing fisheries sustainably, we can actually get a lot more fish out of the oceans. In fact, we can get enough fish to provide people with 1 billion seafood meals every day. 1 billion people could have a seafood meal every day if we just maintain healthy fisheries.
Congressman Lowenthal plans to retire after this term, and though his Break Free from Plastic Pollution bill has been introduced in the House twice, it still hasn't received a floor vote, and Lowenthal says his colleagues need to continue this fight after he leaves office.
Our biggest issue is how do we stop polluting the oceans and looking at the ocean as a resource, and Congress hasn't done.
But with so much on Congress's to-do list, it's unclear if or when Congressman Lowenthal's bill will get a vote before he leaves his office one last time.
The future of ocean health depends on what we do now. There's a lot we don't know, but scientists have developed some cool technology to understand the DNA of the sea. Plus, we'll show you how these lasers are keeping tabs on beach erosion. Stay with us.
Welcome back to our Spectrum News special, Saving Our Oceans, a Deep Dive. I'm Curtis McLeod in Cape Canaveral, Florida.
And I'm Sarah Pila along the coast of Santa Monica, California. Our oceans play an incredibly important role in the well-being of our planet. But there's only so much we know about what's going on beneath the water's surface.
Some new technology could give experts a more accurate way of keeping an eye on the ocean's health.
Rick Adams explores how robots could provide a clearer picture of the DNA of the sea.
The oceans make up over 70% of the surface of our planet, and the most stunning thing, we know startlingly little about them. But new technologies in the robot field are set to change all that. In places, the world's oceans are over 9,000 feet deep. That's 9 Eiffel Towers deeper than the Grand Canyon, which is why robots are better than humans. They can stay deeper for longer and keep an almost constant check on marine life, which, until now, is something we've been unable to do. They'll also be able to map nearly all of the ocean floor. Handy if you're in a submarine and you need to use Google Maps.
The hope is that as technology, battery life, and artificial intelligence improve, scientists will be able to use autonomous underwater robots to sample the eDNA, the little pieces of genetic material that undersea species leave behind, which can then be analysed to find out if certain species you'd expect to be living in an area were thriving or threatened, essentially to discover how biodiverse an area is and track it over time to see how it's doing. Basically, like a marine doctor checking on a patient. That patient being the entire sea.
And through the use of underwater robotic drones, it'll be much more possible to get more consistent data and thus to track the entire health of the oceans themselves in a way that's far more accurate than we've ever seen before. And as scientists note, the impact of climate change is one of the biggest threats to ocean health. So it may just be that checking the DNA of the sea might be one way to bring us all up to speed with really important, accurate, and sophisticated data.
Technology is also helping track beach erosion along our coasts.
And several factors contribute to the loss of sand, including storms, construction, and sea level rise.
Let's check back in with Joe Kwan in San Diego County, where lasers are helping determine how quickly beaches are eroding.
Something's about to go down. Well, the truck spells it out. Research. Project scientist Adam Young and his team are heading to what you might call his office.
This is definitely a place I spend a lot of time.
The beach, a place Adam has been doing research on and surfing at since the 1990s. This project focuses on mapping the changes here along the coastline in San Diego County. The team uses this tool attached to the truck to do their work. This is the smaller version of the usual setup they use, which looks like this. Both tools are LiDAR scanners.
It stands for light detection and ranging. And essentially it's sending out very high frequency laser pulses.
Yes, lasers, pew pew, like those. But you can't actually see these lasers.
Each laser pulse is bouncing off of the surface of the beach or the cliff.
Like the cliffs here along Torrey Pine State Beach in La Jolla. Adam says as the pulses bounce back to the LiDAR, it's essentially measuring the time it takes to return to the scanner. From that, these scientists can figure out how far away the surface is. Each time they do these beach surveys, they're collecting millions of data points every few seconds.
You know, depending how many times you pass the cliff with the laser, you get on the order of a point like every few centimeters on the cliff and on the beach.
The data helps create these high-resolution 3D maps, doing the surveys several times a week, depending on when the low tides are around to give them enough sand to drive on. They can compare the maps and look for change, including tiny changes.
Something like the size of a softball moves, we can see it.
In some areas, they also use drones with the LiDAR technology. It's the type of detail California Coastal Commission senior coastal engineer Leslie Ewing says wasn't available back in the day.
What we've been doing historically is getting shots of the coastal area, coastal bluffs, every 5, 10, 15 years. We would do it with photographs.
Taken from airplanes, which she says is expensive. It also left people like her who use data to help provide guidance for coastal infrastructure projects with lots of questions.
You know, here's the bluff. And then you go back 5 years later and it's here. Well, you don't know what happened.
Leslie says the maps Adam and his team are creating will be game changers.
More and more as we talk about concerns with rising sea level, we're talking about ways to adapt to sea level rise.
Helping coastal communities plan for the future is the reason Adam says his team is doing this work.
As well as to identify, potentially hazardous areas and improve safety along our coastline.
Plus, this surfer scientist says he can't help but do this work.
I think all surfers sort of have a passion for the ocean and understanding the environment.
Though staring at these bluffs from the lineup now, Adam says he can't quite quiet his mind while surfing because of all the questions he hopes to answer.
Now, as we mentioned, sea level rise is one of the main factors for beach erosion. As the earth warms up, the oceans are warming up too, and they're taking on more water.
Experts say it's hard to raise widespread concern over sea level rise because it's a slower moving crisis compared to a wildfire or a hurricane.
But the threat is real. 8 of the world's 10 largest cities are near a coast.
Meteorologist Robert Santos shows us how bad it could get.
One report within the last couple of years showed the ocean could rise 10 to 12 inches by 2050. Keep in mind, that's just 28 years from now. Now, when we think of climate change, some people have images like this, melting ice caps. Now, this is Peterson Glacier in Alaska in 1917. Here it is in 2005. Now, melting glaciers aren't the only factor causing the ocean to rise at an alarming rate. As the planet warms up, the ocean warms up as well through what's called thermal expansion. Now, this adds volume to the ocean, creating a higher sea level. Not good considering 40% of the world's population lives within 60 miles of a coast. That's just over 2 billion people. Now, for a glimpse into the short-term future, we can look to the impacts of king tides. Now, king tides happen a few times a year and can rise 1 to 2 feet higher than the average tide. Experts say that 1 to 2 feet is about how high the ocean will rise within the next few decades. Now, check out these homes in SoCal. Notice how visible the shoreline is. When a king tide rolls in, that land gets swallowed up. Here's another home. Patio is up here, and the water line is down here. King tides comes in, the patio sits right on top of the water. And check out this bridge on a low tide day, and now on a king tide day. Experts say this scenario won't just happen a few times a year. This will be the norm, and again, not in 100 years, but within the next few decades. So what can we do? Well, you can join the King Tides Project. It's a network of city planners, surfers, photographers, teachers, environmentalists, and residents just like you, and who through photo documentation, community, mapping, art, and science are all helping to keep track of how king tides are changing. Now, what about the worst case scenarios? Now, this is the Santa Monica Pier with our present day sea level. Climate Central, an independent group of scientists and communicators, says even if we sharply cut carbon pollution and experience just 1 degree of global warming, watch how the water rises to just below the pier. But if we allow carbon pollution to continue unchecked, watch what happens over hundreds of years with 4 degrees of global warming. Now, look at what could happen to the Statue of Liberty National Monument in New York if pollution continues unchecked over hundreds of years. Now, the California Coastal Commission says we must act now to prevent near-term damage. It says a recent study found that 4.6 feet of sea level rise could threaten damage thousands of miles of highways, piers, and other structures and railways. It can take 20+ years to figure out what to do with all of this and how to do it. And the longer we wait, the fewer options we will have.
In some cases, the way to protect the planet and the ocean lives in the water. But even that could be in jeopardy. We're diving into the kelp forest next.
Research suggests that kelp plays a key role in absorbing carbon dioxide, keeping it out of the atmosphere and preventing rising temperatures. But those rising temperatures are actually wiping out kelp forests. The California Department of Fish and Wildlife says the state's populations have declined by 93% in just the past 5 years because of marine heat waves. I learned how one group restored Orange County's kelp forests and how warming waters are impacting their efforts.
These giant kelp forests are critical to Southern California oceans. Over 800 species rely on them. They help erosion by dampening wave energy, and they absorb carbon dioxide, which is key in curbing climate change. But stressors like pollution, overfishing, and warming waters all contributed to their demise. So in 2002, marine biologist and Get Inspired founder Nancy Caruso began a journey to bring the kelp back with the help of hundreds of volunteers and thousands of students.
Over the course of 10 years of hard work, diving 3 days a week, we were able to restore that ecosystem.
Giant kelp thrives in cooler, nutrient-dense water, but in the last several years, a series of ocean heat waves were deadly for them. First, a phenomenon called the blob, followed by an El Nino. So Nancy, along with volunteer divers Wayne and Julianne, are heading out to survey the kelp's health.
This is really the first cold water year again to watch the kelp grow and to see how it rebounds from all of that stress.
Underwater, the team is counting the kelp, its maturity, and looking for invasive algae species like sargassum, another kelp stressor. But what they find is good news. Some mature kelp that's outlasted the warm spells, but lots of newer kelp.
The young ones are this big, little babies.
So, sounds pretty positive.
Oh yeah, that's excellent. And it's still cool on the bottom, so they still have a chance to grow before the water gets warm this summer.
Overall, seeing kelp in different stages of life is what Nancy considers a successful year. But they can suffer again from warming oceans and out-of-balance ecosystems.
I hope that we continue to see the normal water temperatures and the normal cycles of cold and warm water and nutrients on our coast, so that this can continue, because when the kelp forests are thriving, then everything else thrives too.
It's a promising start, but the work will continue to keep the kelp alive for the future of underwater forests and the future of our oceans.
Oysters can also store carbon. Some coastal communities and ports are using oyster reef balls to clean the ocean and combat rising sea levels. Bree Steffen shows us how someday we might see more of them in places like this.
These are obviously a scallop, but they came with the shell hash.
Sifting through hundreds of oyster shells, Eileen Maher sees building blocks.
Different shell sizes.
Eileen is the Director of Environmental Conservation with the Port of San Diego, and her team hopes to save San Diego South Bay's future by creating reef balls.
The reef balls are made of cement, sand, and the oyster shells. Oysters are attracted to locations where other oysters live.
Scientists say sea level rise is inevitable, set in motion by emissions released decades ago. The Port of San Diego added 360 reef balls in the bay, hoping they will stabilize shorelines, stop erosion, and attract more wildlife. Oysters act as nature's Brita filter, not only storing carbon, but also cleaning the water.
And oysters also filter 50 gallons a day of water.
Dr. Jeff Crooks was an advisor for the project. He's been working in this area for decades and is really excited to see the oyster reef balls finally installed.
These are all examples of sort of restoration projects we can do to help nature help itself and then help us at the same time. And that's what we're really looking for.
This pilot project will be monitored and assessed for 5 years. Researchers will study the growth of native oysters on the reef balls while learning how they impact or enhance local species.
That's what I really hope to do, is that learn lessons so that as we move forward and move into this era of really rapid change, we have a new tool in our tool belt to try and help people and help nature at the same time.
Eileen says their project is starting to gain traction around the U.S. as other cities look to restore their coastlines.
It's really exciting that we can share this project with other people, and it's starting to get interest throughout the state. There are other ports that are looking at this project now and saying, hey, we should be doing the same thing.
Helping nature heal itself, a win for communities everywhere.
Sure, we depend on the ocean for a lot, but it's also home to faces like this and this. However, some human activities have put marine life in harm's way. A look at the future of these whales and some green sea turtles when we come back.
Well, we can't talk about saving our oceans without talking about the animals who call the waters home. Human activities like boating and fishing have put certain whales in harm's way, but protecting those animals comes at a cost for certain industries. Devin Bates is on the Massachusetts coast, where he breaks down the delicate balance between helping the whales and making sure businesses stay afloat.
Marine experts warn the North Atlantic right whale could become extinct unless more is done to save it. It's been a concern since the 1930s and included in the National Endangered Species Act. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration estimates it dropped from 412 whales in January 2018 to just 366 the following year.
Because North Atlantic right whales are in such a critically endangered situation, the bar is very high on what needs to be done.
Gib Brogan helps lead Oceana's efforts to save the North Atlantic right whales. He said 5 years ago, a change in migration patterns set off what's known as an unusual mortality event, due in large part to entanglements with fishing gear and collisions with boats.
Even if a whale doesn't ultimately die because of entanglement, it can affect their ability to feed. The scientists at the New England Aquarium have found that the whales have gotten smaller at a certain age over the last few decades.
From February through April, the North Atlantic right whale can be found feeding off the coast of Massachusetts. Since 2015, federal and state regulations close Cape Cod Bay and waters to the north and east to commercial fishing and the lobster industry during these months.
Over the last 2.5 years, we have developed a weak rope that has helped keep our fishermen fishing while being compliant with the regulations that have come down. The weak rope comes from the New England Aquarium study saying that 1,700 pounds is a threshold that the weakest of the large whales can break, the juveniles.
Eventually, efforts like this could translate to more open waters for the state's lobstermen, but a lengthy permitting process stands in the way of their goal. Meanwhile, Oceana says the bottom line is a balance, and a plan is needed to protect these animals so they're not lost forever.
That needs to happen soon, because the whales can't afford to have a single entanglement.
Boats also put sea turtles in danger. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration says water vessel strikes are a major threat to green sea turtles. It's a problem because sea turtles help maintain the ocean ecosystem. Let's head just a few miles down the coast to Melbourne, Florida, where Will Robinson Smith looks into habitat conservation and rehabilitation.
It's checkup day for the green sea turtle known as Triceratops. Getting her ready for a few x-rays is Shannon Gann, the sea turtle program manager at the Healing Center at the Brevard Zoo in coastal central Florida. She and the team are kept busy with a steady stream of amphibious patients throughout each day.
We can actually see the lungs, we can see bones, and make sure that everything is healing the way that we want it to.
On average, they treat about 15 to 20 sea turtles at a time, but they're seeing a slightly higher than normal number of injured or sick turtles coming in this year. For this turtle, fishing line cut its fin to the bone. It's one of a number of human-caused dangers to these threatened and endangered species. Another increasingly common phenomenon, especially in juvenile green sea turtles, are these tumors caused by a disease called fibropapillomatosis, or FP. The cause of this herpes-like disease is still being studied, but environmental impacts could be playing a role.
We are more reactive than proactive because we can't cure it and we don't have a vaccine for it. But we are trying to do better medicine instead of just cutting them off and hoping they don't regrow.
Researcher Tiffany Dawson and the team at the University of Central Florida's Marine Turtle Research Group monitor much of the nesting side of the equation along the Atlantic coast in Florida. From March to sometimes as late as November, they're out each day checking out the nests of various sea turtles in the roughly 13-mile Archie Carr National Wildlife Refuge.
Loggerheads and greens will lay roughly 105 eggs per clutch. Could be as high as about 120 or kind of lower into 90 or 80.
So far, they've seen less than 100 green sea turtle nests and nearly 4,000 loggerhead nests, which is fairly typical for this point in the nesting season. But those numbers could go as high as 10,000 or greater by the end of the season. Dawson says she's encouraged by the downlisting of the green sea turtles from endangered to threatened, and says they're seeing increasing nesting numbers, in part thanks to better conservation practices.
So it's important to monitor not only the nesting beaches, but the juvenile populations, the offshore populations, and as part of the nesting beach to look at kind of those eggs that nest success. How many hatchlings are making it out.
Sea turtles play a crucial role in maintaining the ocean ecosystem by eating and preserving the health of seagrass, and their eggs, whether hatched or not, are also a key source of nutrients for the dune systems. So the fact that the population of sea turtles is on the rise could be an indication that their home, the Atlantic Ocean, may also be doing better.
It could be people are just reporting them more, or there could be just a lot more green turtles out there. So I'm kind of hoping that both is the key to this, is that we are becoming better stewards of the environment and that the green turtle population is rebounding.
Well, we've reached the end of our time together, but we hope you've learned the ocean provides countless benefits for our planet and all the creatures who live here, including you and me.
So incredibly true, Sarah. It's going to take each and every one of us to protect the waters. That's it for our Spectrum News special, Saving Our Oceans, a Deep Dive. Thank you to Oceana.
And thank you at home for watching.